tonight we're going to spend some time talking about Mount Carmel, and we have a few things we can talk about with that. A little bit of geography, I think, is helpful to us if we understand some things about this mountain. And so I want to share a few things with you tonight. Most of the land around Mount Carmel has thick, rich soil. No, not so much on the mountain, it's a rock. And of course there is some vegetation on top, but nothing like down around the bottom on either side of it, really. But especially as we look out in the Jezreel Valley, it produces abundant vegetation. And in fact, out in the valley, there's a lot of crops, a lot of row crops out that way. And so the Bible mentions some things about the beauty of Mount Carmel. I find that interesting when I look at the mountain, and it kind of looks like a mountain to me. And I've seen mountains that I think are more beautiful. And even when I look at the mountain, I think, well, that's not all that big, really. When we think about some mountains not too far from us, we lived in Asheville, and we'd jump on the parkway, and we'd buzz up the parkway a little bit, and we'd go up to Mount Mitchell every now and again for a sunset at 6,600 feet. You know, these mountains like Mount Carmel aren't anywhere near that. I think Carmel's about 1,700 feet in elevation. But for that area, it stands out. It's a mountain. The Bible mentions some things about the beauty of Carmel, and I think these things have to be sort of taken in a somewhat of a relative term, but a number of references in Scripture in kind of a passing way about Mount Carmel. There's this description of those who are redeemed in God in Isaiah chapter 35 that says this redemption will cause them to shout for joy. The glory of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord and the splendor of our God. And so it's kind of interesting that those who are excited about the redemption, you know, they will relish in the glory of Mount Carmel. Well, I'm not exactly sure I'm seeing that connection. But Carmel was looked at in such a way as being a wonderful mountain, and it's a beautiful spot. Well, I'll grant that. It is that. But then King Solomon, as he was writing to his beloved in the Song of Solomon, he said, your head crowns you like Mount Carmel. And I'm still kind of wondering about that. You're so beautiful, your head looks like a mountain. I'm just not quite, guys, I'm just suggesting that's probably not the way to your wife's heart. All right? Your head looks like a mountain. I mean, don't try that. Don't ask me why, I know. But, you know, so it's just interesting, some of these passing references made to about Mount Carmel. You know, mainly in the Old Testament, but just a little background, a little bit of backstory to some things. Well, there is some historical evidence that suggests that the mountain was used for pagan worship and worship of the ancient gods. I suppose that's no surprise to us, because we find the ancient gods were worshipped in a lot of different places. But some sort of strong evidence that here at Mount Carmel, these things were taking place during the Hellenistic period. Okay, that's kind of the period between Alexander the Great and almost up to the time of Christ, the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BC. That's just 30 years before the birth of Christ. Mount Carmel remained a place of worship there. There was a temple to Zeus there that stood in the mountains. And some records indicate that if you go back to the 4th or 5th century BC, Mount Carmel was known as the Holy Mountain of Zeus. Well, there's some archaeological evidence too. You know, there's a cave on the mountain called Elijah's Cave that for a period of time, perhaps he'd gone there hiding there. And it's on Mount Carmel's western slope. And there's some evidence there that has been found that indicates that it was used for pagan worship, that there may have been a shrine there, in fact. A marble foot from a monument was found on the mountaintop, had the inscription in Mount Carmel, and it was a dedication to Zeus, dating back to the 2nd or 3rd century AD, after Christ. And so the point just being, for a long period of time, here was a place that was used in pagan worship. And evidence that the gods Pan and Eros were worshipped there as well, some Greek gods. But Really, none of this evidence is surprising to us, and really not all that consequential, I don't think. But it confirms some things we already know. But what we have is a better documented event about worship to pagan gods, and maybe even a place of worship of Jehovah God. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And the document that we have is God's Word. It records for us events that took place on Mount Carmel. And a pretty incredible story that takes place and unfolds right there. But before we get to that, still, I want to spend a few moments here understanding the lay of the land, because this area is rich in history and in Bible content, in the Bible story. Already in our study going through the Bible story as we've been doing in Genesis and on, we've already seen some episodes that have taken place in the area, in the region, throughout the Jezreel Valley. We've been all over the Jezreel Valley already. And so there's some things we know about it because of that. I want us to be able to picture in our mind, and we have some more stories coming up in our studies. I want us to be able to picture in our mind Mount Carmel and the Jezreel Valley. They kind of go together. If you're in the Jezreel Valley, you can see Mount Carmel over there. And if you're on top of Mount Carmel, you can see all the way across the Jezreel Valley. And I want us to have that in our mind when we talk about some stories that are coming up, in our classes. Maybe this will be helpful. And so here again, we're looking at this picture of Mount Carmel. We are looking at the southwest side of the mountain. So the mountain range, if there is a range, the Carmel Mountains, it's kind of at an angle like this. And so if we're looking at the southwest side of it like this, behind us is the Mediterranean Sea. It's several miles away still, but that would be what's behind us. And so we're trying to get our coordinates pulled together here. So if we look at a map and we see then here, Mount Carmel, and we're standing down here, we're looking at that southwest side of the mountain, and the sea is back here behind us. Now, some of the things we're going to be talking about tonight happen not on this side of the mountain. It happens over on the other side, on the east side of the mountain, here in the Jezreel Valley, because that's what this is here, is the Jezreel Valley. And the Kishon River comes right up through here. And so, getting our bearings again, we see some places on the map that, are familiar to us. We see Jerusalem way down here, and so that's a long way from where Mount Carmel is at. And we look at Mount Tabor and Gilboa, these mountains here, come into play in the Bible story. We've already seen some things take place around Gilboa, or at least we're about to. In just a few chapters, we'll see some things that take place at Mount Gilboa. And I want to point out this over here, Caesarea Maritime as it's called. It has nothing to do with the Old Testament. And in fact, it's not even there in the Old Testament period of time, okay? But I think there's some significance to that, and there's a bit of a tie-in. So if we're standing on top of Mount Carmel now, and we are looking off in that southwest direction, we look out here, we can just barely see there and there the Mediterranean Sea. It's not that far away. It's about 6 miles across, or 8 miles down here to, well, actually that's Caesarea Maritime right down there. You can just barely see it. It's not that far, but it's very humid there. You're right next to the Mediterranean Sea. And it's hot, and so you have humidity. And so some days you can't see the sea from the top of Mount Carmel, though it's not that far away. On a day maybe when the wind is blowing out to the sea a little bit and some of that haze is blown away, in fact, then you can see it pretty well. But Caesarea, of course, has nothing to do with the Old Testament story. In fact, some things we're talking about, studying about tonight, Caesarea Maritime wasn't even there at that time. But, again, just understanding, it's just down here. It's about 8 miles down there. And so what is kind of significant is here is Caesarea Maritime, or the remnants of that. This is a city built by Herod right before Jesus was born and in some of the years following the birth of Jesus. And it was a pretty significant city. It had a harbor there. It was a place of great commerce, people coming in and out. And so there was a lot of things happening. There's more to say about that when you're studying the life of Paul and Paul spent some time in Caesarea, you might remember. We'll save that story for a different time. But here's the connection to Mount Carmel. This is why I bring all of this up. Because literally there was a connection between Caesarea Maritime and the springs of Mount Carmel. You see, the Romans, they built this aqueduct. And that's how water came to Caesarea Maritime, because for there to be a city there, there had to be plenty of salt water, but there were not freshwater springs. And so they brought the water in from Mount Carmel, and the springs of Mount Carmel. And so that's kind of an interesting connection there to me. And so, looking again here at Mount Carmel on our map, you see that there? It's not mentioned, as we see, there's some of these passing mentions of Carmel and its beauty in Scripture. But actual stories that come from Mount Carmel, I only know of a couple. I want us to take a few minutes and look at this 2 Kings passage, 2 Kings chapter 4. There's a story here that is familiar, I think, to us. 2 Kings chapter 4. This is that story with the Shunammite woman. Do you remember that? Kind of an interesting story that unfolds. It involves Elijah. Now, understand, Elisha. Our main story tonight is with Elijah. Different. They're both prophets, but at a little bit different time. Now let's look here. Read just a few verses beginning at verse 8. One day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat, and she said to her husband, I know this man who comes our way often is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us. This is the story. This is that unfolding story and this relationship between Elisha, this woman and her husband, and a son who is to come along. So during the period of the divided kingdom, Elisha was a prophet of God to the nation of Israel. And so as he passed through the Jezreel Valley, that we kind of have a picture in our mind of now, he would frequently stay in the town of Shunem. Well, let's look at this, okay? Right here, here's Mount Carmel. Here's a town on the map named. Well, right next to that is where this town of Shunem is at. And so this is where Elisha coming through would stop, and now he had a place to stay. The woman and her husband, they built a place for him there. This friendly couple was taking care of him every time he came through. And so there came a time when Elisha wanted to repay the woman for her kindness that she had shown him. And since the couple was childless, Elisha's servant Gehazi recommended that the couple be provided with a son. And so, a blessing from God. And Elisha promised them a child, and about a year later a son was born. So years later, the young man was working out in the field. In chapter 8, we would read about he developed a headache, and he went home and he died in his mother's arms. And so you can imagine, distraught. That's what she was. She was distraught. And what she says here in verse 22, she called her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return. Why go to him today? He asked. It's not the new moon or the Sabbath. It's all right, she said. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you. So she set out and she came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So again, it's one of the few times in Scripture that we have Mount Carmel that comes into the Bible story. And so the woman, she rushes to Elisha at Mount Carmel. And when he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, look, there's the Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? Everything is all right, she said. Which I'm not understanding that response. And then her action after that, when she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet, and Gehazi came over to push her away. But the man of God said, leave her alone. She is in bitter distress. But the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why. Oh, but the story goes on. And he comes to know and to understand what happened to the son. And there's a blessing, again, that comes to them with their son. And I bring this up only because I want us to bring Mount Carmel back into the picture again. I want us to see this connection. And I want us to see and just think about some other Bible stories that take place there in the Jezreel Valley. And maybe sometimes Carmel is mentioned, but nobody's at Carmel. They're in the valley. And to remember, again, that if you were in the Jezreel Valley, if you were over at Mount Gilboa, if you could turn and look to the east, you would see way over there, you would see Mount Carmel. It was prominent in that way. And so it becomes a very visual point in the Bible story. And that's what we can see. So it's possible that from Mount Carmel, you can see the entire distance all the way to the city of Shunem, where the woman lived, Shunammite woman lived, because it's set at the hill of Mount Morah. And so you wonder a little bit. I mean, could Elisha really see her coming all of that way? I don't know about that. He'd have to have binocular eyes, I think, to be able to see that far. Because if you're up here on top of the mountain again, where this photo comes from, well, that Nain or Shunem is over here about that far away. I'm not sure I could see two people riding a donkey across there until they got up a lot closer. But at some point, Elisha was able to look out and see her and recognize her for who she was, because we just read that. We know at some point that he could see her that way. And so, looking here at this picture, a couple of pictures here. We looked at the map again a moment ago, getting our bearings on that. Here we have a picture of the Jezreel Valley. We've already made some reference to that. And we think about some of the Bible stories that we've already covered in Sundays and Wednesdays that took place in the Jezreel Valley. Here it is. Get a look at this. Understand where some of these things have happened, where some of these things have taken place. Shunem, where the woman was from, and where her son died, and where Elisha went and stayed frequently. There's some other stories that take place here too. Okay, let's look a little more closely at some of these. The spring of Herod. All right, we just read not too long ago about the story that took place there. Do you remember what that was? In Herod, the spring of Herod, what happened there? We were about that just a few weeks ago. Who was there? Gideon. What happened? What happened at that spring?
He had a test of the men.
Yeah, there was a test. He had a test of the men, all right? Because there were thousands, tens of thousands prepared to go to battle against the Midianites, and God said, "Now you got too many." Remember? And they got whittled down to how many? 300. The ones that leapt out of the spring. Remember? Well, Judges chapter 7. That's where it was. And in fact, that battle with the Midianites, it took place. It took place right out here in this plain. That's where it happened at, in this Jezreel Valley. And then there is Jezreel over here, the town of Jezreel. And we haven't got to this part yet, but Naboth's vineyard is there. And wicked King Ahab came in, and long story short, he killed Naboth. He stole that. He took that vineyard. That's where it was at. That's where that happened at. And then just looking out across that valley, you might remember the story in 2 Kings 9 where the watchman there in Jezreel, he was the watchman on a tower, looked out and saw Jehu's chariot and saw him driving. How did he know it was Jehu that was coming? You might remember? What identified him? His driving. He drives like a wild man. It must be Jehu, okay? And who is Jehu? Now, we haven't got there yet in our story, I know, but who knows? Who is Jehu? Huh? No, not David's commander. And this is during the period of the divided kingdom now. Jehu had just been anointed king of Israel by God. Oh, there was already a king of Israel right now, but not for long. and the king of Judah. And Jehu was coming from Ramoth Gilead, which is not on this map, because Ramoth Gilead is way back here on the other side of the Jordan River. He had come quite a ways to come here to Jezreel, to come to this part. And when Jehu came, the long story short is that it was there that he killed Joram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah. It was in a battle. He shot both of them in their chariots right there in the Jezreel Valley. You know, you could turn around and see Mount Carmel from where all that happened at. Mount Gilboa. We're just about to study some things that happened at Mount Gilboa. Think of anything significant that happens there shortly in our studies? You'll know soon. You already know. You're just not remembering right now. 2 significant men die at Mount Gilboa. You think about that? King Saul and his son Jonathan. Mount Gilboa, right there. You can see it from Mount Carmel, just across that Jezreel Valley. And then you can see on this map here, we put on here Nazareth. Well, no, that's not in the Jezreel Valley. But you can see across the Jezreel Valley, and you can see a little rise over there. And where that rise is at is where the city of Nazareth is at. You can actually see that from Mount Carmel on a clear day. You could see that rise across there. And then the Kishon River, do you see that on there? That river becomes very significant in the story we're about to look at. That river right there. And so I'm not sure how far that is from Mount Carmel, but it's a little ways across there, a couple miles maybe, perhaps 3, I don't know, from the top of the mountain. But it becomes very important in the lesson we're looking at tonight. And so we're just looking at some of these things. I want to get a picture in your head. I want us to think. I want us to be able to see this valley. I want us to be able to think about this valley and this mountain. I want us to know what it looks like. I want us to know where it's at. So that as we go through our Bible classes, our Bible story, and then we're back in the Jezreel Valley again, I want this to click into our mind and to know where it's at and what it looks like. And to know that if you're wherever you are in the Jezreel Valley, that if you look to the east, you would see Mount Carmel right over there. And there's something in the story we're studying tonight that's an incredible story that happens right on top of that mountain. And so that takes us then to 1 Kings chapter 18. Will you go with me? 1 Kings chapter 18. I know this is a familiar story. We're not treading any new ground tonight. But we're trying to just pull out this week some mountaintop moments. Significant things that happen on mountains that are familiar to us, that maybe we leave this week understanding and knowing some things about these mountains that we didn't know before. Here it's on this mountain where Elijah, another prophet of God, stands alone against 450 men. He takes up a battle position, so to speak. But he's on the side of the Lord. Elijah's name, you know what it means? Elijah. You remember that? Jehovah is God. That's what Elijah means. I mean, his name makes a powerful proclamation. And in this story tonight that we're about to read, you'll see that he is dependent, he is looking to God, he is dependent on God. And so this becomes a very powerful story tonight, not just in the time of the Bible era, but to us today. It's a powerful story of strength, confidence, faith. A very powerful story that teaches us some things about God's willingness to stand for those who would do right. And all of these things come through in the story tonight. So let's understand the backstory, because there's always a backstory. And sometimes the backstory is very important for us to understand what's going on in what we are about to read. So understand that Ahab is king of Israel. Now, who can tell me something about King Ahab? Well, what do we know about him? He's an evil. He's like way evil. And he has a real good helper with his wife, Jezebel, who seems to have had quite an influence on him. I'm not saying he was a good guy before. He seemed to be less of a good guy after Jezebel. She had influence. She had real influence in a bad way over him. So to understand who we're dealing with, our lesson is in chapter 18, but to turn back a page. We're going back to chapter 16. 1 Kings chapter 16, and let's just use this for an introduction to the king. Verse 29. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel. And he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Boy, stop there for just a second. Think of that. That's quite a statement. Because the kings leading up to this point in time in Israel, not one of them have been good. And they have done everything possible to lead Israel far, far away from Jehovah God. And now, we look at Ahab, and it's like, he's worse than all the ones before. I think that's pretty significant. Okay, keep going, verse 31. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him. Okay, so now we've been properly introduced to Ahab. And we need to know something about him because he is prominent in the story that we read about in chapter 18. In chapter 18, we read about Elijah, this prophet of God. This prophet of God whose very name means Jehovah is God. It's a proclamation. Elijah stood alone on Mount Carmel. And he's about to deal with and have to face 450 prophets of Baal. But actually there's more than that. We always talk about the 450 prophets of Baal, but will you notice that when we read this, there's more than 450 prophets of Baal. There's some other prophets too. These prophets all ate at the table of Jezebel, it says. Now tell me something. When it says that, what exactly does that mean? They ate at the table of Jezebel. What's that indicate? And there's a relationship there. These were her prophets. She was the one that was kind of pulling the strings on this. And so, in chapter 18, verse 16, so Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him. And Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" He didn't care anything at all for Elijah because Elijah had made a proclamation caused rain to stop. "Oh, you troubler of Israel." Well, the reason he did that is because Ahab was not listening to God. He was not listening to the prophet of God. This is what God brought upon Ahab and Israel. But Ahab's going to blame Elijah about that. Verse 18. "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied. "But you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring forth the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Okay, now we're starting to see the story. Now we're seeing what's unfolding. And we know who's involved. We know the key players. And we know where this is happening at. We're on Mount Carmel. And in fact, this confrontation, this challenge here that's going to be offered happens on Mount Carmel. Someone said, "Well, where on Mount Carmel?" Well, I don't know exactly. I can't tell you that part. It just says on Mount Carmel. So it's somewhere on Mount Carmel that these things are happening. But here also we see is this call to Israel. Elijah said, make a call to Israel and have them come here to me at Mount Carmel. It's a challenge. This is a challenge to Israel. Because he is going to challenge Israel. You have to make a decision. You have to make a choice. Who are you going to stand with? Who are you going to stand for? That's the challenge. You're going to have to take a stand. There's a moment of decision that is coming. And so let's get the picture of what's going on in Israel. Their king is the most wicked king they've had thus far. And he has led them farther away from Jehovah God than any of the wicked kings before them have done. And Ahab's wife, Jezebel, basically has the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah, living in the house, so to speak. And so this is the state of Israel. And so when Elijah calls upon them to see and to know and understand Jehovah God, my impression is basically Israel is standing around like this. And they're not making a move. They're kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. I don't know if they're listening to Elijah any more than just waiting to see, well, what's going to happen here? Let's see how this turns out. They could go either way. And in fact, I think they're more the other way than they are with Elijah. Because the nation of Israel at this point is at a very evil state. It's a very evil place. I'm not saying that Elijah is all alone. He comes to think that later on in the next story. But there are not many who are standing for Jehovah God. That part we know. And so this challenge here that comes up is quite interesting. In fact, I think it's one that you and I need to take to heart. Because we have to make the same choice. I mean, okay, it's not about prophets of Baal. I get that. And let's understand that perhaps all over this mountain are shrines and monuments and places to worship. The Baals and the Asherah poles are probably there. I know we don't face that. But our challenge is still the same. Our challenge is to choose whom we will serve. So what Joshua said way back, remember we looked through that? But there's going to be a similar statement here that Elijah makes. That I think is rather profound, really. And so we have this picture in our mind. We could be down here on the bottom. We could be standing in the Jezreel Valley, and we're looking up there on Mount Carmel, and we can imagine, we can picture this exchange as it's taking place. And we can picture as Ahab sends out his messengers across Israel, saying, your prophet Elijah is calling you up to Mount Carmel. Because something's going to happen here. I'm not sure anybody knew what was going to happen at this point. But what becomes very clear to me is that even when everybody else comes, those who are Israelites, those who are supposed to be of the chosen body of the children of Israel, Elijah is standing alone. He's alone. And to think about the strength and the fortitude required for him to say some things he is going to say, and the challenge that he is going to level to everyone who is there is impressive to me. It's very impressive. You riding with me so far? All right, I know it's not been much of a class. It's been very preachy. I know. That's hard. Stay awake. But I haven't figured out how to do the class part yet on this. It's just this unfolding story. And it is such an incredible story. And I have this picture in my mind of what it looks like. And the events as they're unfolding. And can you even see and imagine that on the trails, the roads that came up on Mount Carmel, can you even imagine when those roads became filled with Israelites coming from all parts of Israel, coming to see what they had been called to hear? And prominent are those 450 Baals, prophets of Baal, and the prophets of the Asherah are there. It has to be quite a gathering, don't you figure? Can you see that? So let's look at what happens now. Let's just think about where this goes from here. Looking at our text, we'll look again at verses 19 and 20. We kind of read through that. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel. And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Verse 21. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. See, that's the part I was referring to. You know, where it just seems like the people are standing there with their arms folded. They've got their hands in their pockets. They have no opinion. Well, actually, they do. I'm not sure that you can ever be at a point of no opinion. You have to side one way or the other. And here, what is being presented, you have on one side. It's like, you know, the boxing ring is put up on one side. You have Jehovah God. And on the other, you have the prophets of Baal. You know, we have Baal on the other side. There's a battle that's about to take place. And it's like, seemingly nobody knows which side to stand on. Surely there are those who are the followers of Baal. And like we said, I'm sure there are those who are followers of Jehovah God. But nobody's saying anything. Nobody is saying, you tell him, Elijah. You tell him. Nobody's standing up and saying anything. They just stood there. And so can you see that storyline as it's unfolding? You see what's happening. A call to Israel. How long will you waver? How long will you bounce between two opinions? And basically, Elijah is saying, the day has come where you will have to choose. I've wondered sometimes if in fact we would benefit if we just got lined up like that. And there was a prophet of God saying, all right, what's it going to be? In fact, I think sometimes we might even need to challenge each other. And when we are struggling somehow in faith, and when we have not made a firm decision on where we are and where we stand, we're trying to straddle the fence, as we say. We're wavering between two opinions. That it would be a good brother or sister that comes to us and looks us square in the face and says, all right, what's it going to be? How long will you waver between two opinions? You have to make a decision. Because basically, that's what Elijah is saying to Israel. They will have to choose. That's what this story is about. There's an incredible outcome to this. Because it's not done. It's just getting started good right now. We see what's going to happen here. There was silence. And that seems to be great dismay to Elijah. Verse 22. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left. But Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let them choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. And then the people all said, what you say is good. There's the challenge. It's like, we're going to see. We are going to find out whose God is the true God. And so Elijah challenged them, and he challenged their God. And maybe that's one of the more significant points. He challenged their God. Their God who's not really a God. Their God that they have shrines for, and they have monuments, they have idols that they've made, they have the Asherah poles, they have all of these things. They're gods that aren't even really gods. They're gods which are figures that they have made with their own hands. They're gods that have no power in any way at all. I'm thinking in some ways, I'm thinking in a great way. There's no challenge here at all. Because Jehovah, God's power is incredible. And it's about to be released on them. And they are about to see the power, the true God. And so, you probably know this story. Let's break this protocol of preachy for a minute. Okay? What happens now? How does this unfold now? You tell me. You know the story. Tell me about it.
There's a challenge.
There's a challenge. How so? So we try to picture that, okay? I mean, it's another one of those pictures that is just incredible and hard to understand. So Ben and Stacy are teaching Mount Carmel. And he got real excited about a month ago thinking about teaching the kids here in VBS all week about Mount Carmel. And he says, I got a great idea. And he says, I've got to do something, to impress on these kids how fire came from heaven and the meat and the wood and everything was just consumed by God, even though it had been doused with water. And he says, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go outside behind the church, but in the parking lot, the lower lot, and I'm going to build an altar. And we're going to have buckets of water, and the kids can put water on it and everything like that. He said, what I need from you, from your past firefighting experience is, how can I make that combust right before their eyes? And I'm a firefighter, and I put fires out. I know how to start fires. And I said, there's ways to do this. I said, but I'm not sure that would be the most memorable thing. What will be the most memorable thing is the Taylor's Fire Department pulling up behind the church building, And I said, I'm not sure this is a good idea. He said, it's a great idea. I said, Ben, this is not a good idea. And he finally kind of backed off of all of that. I appreciate his enthusiasm, but thankful he changed his mind. But we have a picture. Right.
So I'm trying to teach them that. I had to teach this particular lesson a couple times in the 2-year-old class.
This doesn't mean anything, right?
It doesn't hit the same as us thinking about that thing was so wet, it was puddles. And it's not going to burn if we do it. But God was able to send enough fire, enough power to just...
So we get a picture of that in our mind. Okay? Let's digress for just a moment. And let's think about, where did this happen at? Well, Mount Carmel. Yeah, we know. Where on Mount Carmel? I don't know. Here's this aerial view of Mount Carmel. It doesn't even look like a mountain, does it? But this is the top of Mount Carmel. This is the peak of it right there. You can go there today. You can walk right up to this point. In fact, you see a little building, right here. It's a monastery, actually, is what that is. And this is looking to the southwest, out to the Mediterranean Sea, and the Jezreel Valley we've talked so much about. It's on this other side. And so somewhere on top of this mountain is where this story is unfolding. Up there now is a monastery that's been around now for some time. This building I don't think is particularly all that old. But a monastery that's called the Carmelite order monastery is there. And you can go there and you can look around inside, and it is dedicated to the prophet Elijah. And it's an order of the Catholic, it's a Catholic religious order. And, they worship Saint Elijah that they have there. And so you go inside this monastery, and they have a sanctuary there where their worship takes place and things such as that. And goes back to about the 12th century is where this order, as they say, of the Catholic Church came about during the days of the Crusades, when the Catholic Church was moving out and growing into other places and new places. And so that's what you find on top of this mountain now. In one area around the side of the mountain, there's a cave called Elijah's Cave. And there it is said that in years past that there were hermits that lived there, dedicating their lives to a life of celibacy and honoring Elijah as their saint. What does this have to do with the Bible? Well, not a thing. But just to know that this is what's on top of the mountain there today, okay, to understand what's there. And to think about this story as it's unfolding, and to understand the position of Elijah, whom they worship. I'm not saying we should worship Elijah. In fact, I would say we should not. We worship the God that Elijah was talking about, is what we do. But here there's this statue of Elijah as he's about to take a sword to one of the prophets of Baal, I presume, is who that would be. But it's there from the top of that monastery that you can see this view, looking out across that Jezreel Valley that we've talked about so much tonight. And it's from here somewhere that this episode is taking place. And this is what they could have seen in that time long ago. And they could have looked down into the valley at the Kishon River down there, not knowing what was going to happen to them. But Elijah is going to walk them down there before too long. And that story will come to an end. But that's what's happening on top of this mountain as we're reading through. Let's go to our text again. Verse 25. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning to noon. Oh, Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. And so they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Can you imagine? You got to stop and just think about this on top of this mountain. Here's what's going on right now. They're crying to their God, shouting to him. They're dancing around. They're mutilating themselves because somehow this will get the attention of their God. That's what's happening right now. 29 midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Imagine that. Their God let them down. Nothing happened. Their God did not show. He didn't come. Did these prophets believe their gods? Did they? Yeah. I mean, were they dedicated to their faith? Obviously. Yeah, the answer is yes. Are you with me? The answer is yes. They were dedicated to their faith. Did they expect that their gods would respond? Yeah, they did. They obviously did. But their gods had no power. Their gods had no authority. Their gods were not real. These prophets and followers had followed a doctrine and a philosophy far removed from that of Jehovah God. And let's understand, they had many followers. These prophets of Baal had been quite successful in at the very least, suppressing the faith of the children of Israel. Remember the ones, how long will you waver between two opinions? The ones who said nothing, who just stood there, hands in their pocket, expressing nothing, one way or the other. So at the least, these prophets of Baal were successful at getting the minds of the children of Israel placed in neutral. I think judgment's about to come. And if it's not judgment against the prophets of Baal, it's going to be judgment against all of those who refuse to turn to Jehovah God and serve and worship Him. That's the judgment that's about to come. And Elijah is saying, y'all don't make up your mind. It's going to happen right now. That's what's happening. That's where we are in the story. Verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him. He repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. Okay, tells us something. Had Jehovah God been worshipped there before? Yeah, there was an altar there, but it was in ruins. Okay? Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said. And they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. And at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed. Just imagine being in front of these 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, and your kinsmen that have come from all over Israel, and who have come up the mountain, basically surrounding you. Elijah is the only one who has taken a stand for Jehovah God. One. He's one. And all of these others around him. How far off of the mountain did they go? Did they flow? I don't know. They came from all over Israel. That's all I know. The picture in my mind makes me think there's a lot of people there. 36. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. I want you to talk to me some about Elijah. Tell me some things about Elijah, some things that come to your mind right now about the man Elijah. Tell me some things about Elijah. Courage. Courage, yeah. Oozes out with courage. What else?
Passionately devoted.
Passionately devoted. What else?
Confident.
What's that?
Confident.
Confident. I like this. Confident. There is no, please God, if you can you help me in this situation? No. Nothing like that at all. What else? What else about Elijah?
He wants others to obey and know God.
Yeah, he's calling others. He's calling others to obey God. No, yes. What else?
Faithful.
Faithful. He's faithful to God. What else?
Bold.
Bold. I mean, you got the picture? We're on top of Mount Carmel.
He also had a sense of humor a little bit.
Yeah.
The things he said to all of them.
He might be a little sarcastic.
Yes.
Okay. All right, all right.
And I think you see the contrast there. Like, he's being sarcastic when they're doing it, but then
Oh, hey, good point.
he flips the switch and he's very
Reverent now.
very
Okay, yeah. He was kind of sarcastic with them when they're calling on their God. But now when he dresses Jehovah God, boy, did you see that switch? You know, a total change of reverence that's there, Joe.
He stands out to me that even his confidence, all the stuff he's seen, he still gets discouraged with the conditions that he's in later on. But God has grace for that and provides encouragement to him.
That's right.
Not above things, even after this major victory of having low points as well.
And you know, I'm not so sure that we're not like that sometimes too, that we can go through a period of time that is just incredible. Things go well. We are incredibly blessed and we feel closer to God than we've ever been. And then we hit a low spot right after that. How does that happen? But I think it does happen to Elijah, because soon after this he hits a point where he goes, I'm the only one. I'm all that's left. And God lets him know, no, you're not. So, this picture of Elijah praying to Jehovah God, and that you are turning their hearts. Whose hearts? Israel. Turning their hearts back again. Verse 38, then fire from the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Can you imagine? No, I can't. I can't just quite even hardly understand that. But it happened right there, right then, on top of Mount Carmel. This happened. And when the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried. I bet they did. They couldn't find their face fast enough on the ground. That's what happened. And they cried, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away. Seize them. And Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. You know where that's at? Right down the mountain by that river. Remember? That's where they went. Why'd they take them down there? I don't know. But he didn't slaughter them on the mountain. Took them down to the valley. And that's what happened. God appeared to them. No, well, not physically. But God appeared to them in power and in might. Here is a prayer that was absolutely, totally answered right before their eyes. You had one man standing against the majority who had courage and great faith in God, who helped to move the hearts of many lost souls because he stood against evil. Can we make something of that?
Kind of a side point to that, but I'm a numbers guy, so I got to thinking, what kind of event would this be? The fire consuming the altar. And so, using the 2 seas of seed, roughly 5 gallons of water. I get from the reading that this was a pretty quick event. I don't know if it was necessarily instantaneous, but it was quick. The fire would have had to have been so hot that it would have been hotter than anything they could obtain by the means of technology at this time.
Mm-hmm.
So
If the altar's gone.
not only would this altar be gone to the point of getting rid of stone, and on top of the water evaporating it, it would have been so hot that it would have been like a fireball that they could have never seen and never would see again.
Mm-hmm.
It would be equivalent to that of a lightning strike.
And And that's kind of the view that I would have if you've been close to a lightning strike, what that is and what that does. Could you imagine what happened there? Something that they would talk about for the rest of their lives. You know, and for generations. Oh, in fact, for many generations. And we are still talking about it today. That's what happened on Mount Carmel. You know, it's an incredible place to think about. We know. It's one of those few places that you can go in Israel, and you can stand on top of Mount Carmel and you can say, I know what happened here. You know, because that's where it was at. That's where it happened at. And there's a lot of places you can say, well, somewhere over there this happened, and somewhere over there. No, on Mount Carmel, we know what happened on Mount Carmel. I hope you've enjoyed the journey tonight. We've made our climb to the top of Mount Carmel. Hope it's been helpful to you. Thank you.